48 hostages, 72 hours, a demand that could redraw the map of the Middle East forever. On October 13, 2025, Donald Trump declared to the entire world that the Gaza war was over. But behind the scenes of this historic agreement lies a demand that shakes the very foundations of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A demand so radical that some see it as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. What has happened these past few weeks exceeds everything political analysts had imagined. And this is only the beginning. Let's go back 3 weeks. On September 29, 2025, Donald Trump stands alongside Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. In his hands, a 20-point document that promises to end 2 years of devastating war. But this is no ordinary peace plan. This is an ultimatum. Trump gives Hamas 3 to 4 days to respond. Not 3 weeks, not 3 months, 3 days. And if Hamas refuses, Trump speaks these chilling words: Israel will do what it needs to do. The pressure is total. Arab countries have signed, Muslim nations have signed, Israel has signed. Only Hamas remains, and the world holds its breath. The demands are unprecedented in the modern history of the conflict. First demand, the immediate release of the 48 remaining hostages. 20 of them are still alive. The others are nothing more than bodies that will have to be found in the rubble of Gaza. Hamas must locate them and hand them over within 72 hours of the agreement. 72 hours, not 1 minute more. Check. Exchange, Israel will release nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, including 250 serving life sentences. But it's the second demand that changes everything. The complete disarmament of Hamas. Not a reduction of weapons, not a limitation. Total and definitive disarmament. Trump repeated it on October 14th with brutal clarity. If Hamas doesn't disarm voluntarily, the United States will intervene themselves, quickly and perhaps violently. This is the first time in history that an American president has threatened direct military action against a Palestinian organization. Why is this demand so revolutionary? Because since its creation in 1987, Hamas has made armed resistance its very identity. Asking Hamas to surrender its weapons is like asking a state to dissolve its military. The movement already refused this condition in August 2024, declaring it would only lay down arms when an independent Palestinian state was established and Israeli occupation ended. But something has changed. Under crushing diplomatic pressure from Egypt, Qatar and Turkey, coordinated by Trump himself, Hamas has begun to yield. Sources close to the negotiations reveal that Hamas officials have privately admitted they might accept a process to dismantle their offensive weapons. Not all their weapons, not immediately, but it's a stunning reversal for an organization that has fought Israel for nearly 40 years. The third demand concerns the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. But, careful, this is not a complete withdrawal. Trump presented a map showing exactly where Israel will maintain control. Israeli forces will remain 6.5 kilometers inside southern Gaza, 2 kilometers in the center, and 3.5 kilometers in the north. This is the most limited withdrawal ever proposed in recent negotiations. By comparison, a plan presented in July 2024 provided that Israeli troops would penetrate only 1.6 kilometers maximum into Gaza. Hamas has always demanded total withdrawal. But this time, it had no choice. Trump made it clear, accept now or face the consequences. Netanyahu repeated it. The Israeli military will remain in most of Gaza, period. But there's a fourth dimension to this plan that makes observers shudder. Trump talks about transforming Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. A tourist paradise with luxury beaches, 5-star hotels, investments of tens of billions of dollars. Except this paradise wouldn't be intended for Gazans. Leaks reveal that the Trump administration is considering the voluntary displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to neighboring Arab countries. Egypt, Jordan, perhaps Lebanon. in exchange for massive financial compensation. It's an idea that echoes plans proposed decades ago by American Christian Zionists who saw in the separation of peoples the only solution to the conflict. For some, this is forced demographics. For others, it's the realization of an ancient biblical vision, because this is where things become prophetic. Since the 1980s, certain evangelical Zionist Christians, who constitute a massive electoral base for Trump, have a very particular reading of the Bible. They believe that total Jewish control of the land of Israel is a necessary condition for Christ's return, and the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of peace mentioned in Revelation. For them, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank must return under Israeli sovereignty, not for political or military reasons, but to fulfill biblical prophecies. In 1988, a Canadian Pentecostal pastor named William Lovell Hull had proposed a similar plan to Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. Hull based his plan on the story of Esau and Jacob in Genesis. Esau, whom he associated with Arabs, had voluntarily left Canaan to settle on Mount Seir, leaving the promised land to his brother Jacob, ancestor of the Israelites. For Hull, this was the model to follow, a peaceful but definitive separation between Jews and Arabs. His plan never succeeded, but today Trump's plan bears an uncanny resemblance to this vision. October 13, 2025 will remain etched in history. On that day, the 20 hostages still alive were freed by Hamas and handed over to the Red Cross in Gaza. Scenes of indescribable joy erupted in Tel Aviv at Hostage Square. Families cried, screamed, danced. After 2 years of unbearable anguish, their loved ones were finally back. Trump arrived in Israel a few hours later. He gave a speech before the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, in which he congratulated Netanyahu for having the courage to say, "It's over, we won, now let's enjoy our lives." It was a triumphal moment. Trump, who covets the Nobel Peace Prize, was hailed as a hero. Giant banners with his face were hung in the streets of Jerusalem. A former hostage, Omer Shem Tov, addressed Trump directly. "I told you that you were sent by God to save us. I still believe it today." Powerful words, words that resonate with the theology of millions of American evangelicals. But is the war really over, as Trump claims? Netanyahu was clear in a video statement. The campaign is not finished. The Israeli government approved the first phase of the plan, but did not vote to end the war. Why? Because everything now depends on what Hamas does in the coming weeks. If the movement begins to disarm, if heavy weapons are surrendered, if tunnels are sealed, then perhaps peace will hold. But if Hamas attempts to maintain its military capabilities in secret, if rockets are still fired, if attacks resume, Trump has promised that everything will be back in play. And this time, it won't just be Israel striking, it will be the United States themselves. Worrying signs are already emerging. On the morning of October 12th, as the agreement had just been announced, Israeli strikes hit several areas of Gaza. Palestinian civil defense reported dozens of dead. Israel claims these were defensive operations against immediate threats. But this shows the fragility of the agreement. Moreover, anti-Hamas militias are multiplying throughout Gaza. According to the Times of Israel, there could be up to 10 different armed groups operating in the enclave. 3 of them have publicly supported Trump's plan: the Northern Popular Forces, the Popular Defense Forces, and the Rafah Popular Forces. These militias are composed of Gazan clans that have fought Hamas in recent months, often because of family vendettas or political disagreements. One of their leaders, Hussam al-Astal, declared, "We will fight Hamas until it is finished, not us. We are here and we're not moving." If these groups receive support from the United States and Israel, it could create an internal civil war in Gaza that would cause thousands of additional deaths. And then there's the question that obsesses all analysts: what will happen after Trump? The American president himself admitted he couldn't predict the future, but he promised he would continue to fight for whoever to preserve peace. The problem is that Trump will leave the White House in January 2029. What will happen then? If a Democratic president returns to power and adopts a different approach, will everything collapse? The Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, wasn't even invited to the main negotiations. It was completely sidelined. Yet it's the Palestinian Authority that administers the West Bank and is supposed to represent Palestinians on the international stage. How can you build lasting peace without including the recognized Palestinian political entity? It's a gigantic omission that could blow up the entire edifice in a few months. But let's return to the prophecies, because there's something deeply troubling about the way current events seem to echo ancient texts. In the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, the prophet describes a massive invasion of Israel by a coalition of nations led by Gog of the land of Magog. This war, known as the War of Gog and Magog, ends with a spectacular divine intervention that destroys the enemy armies. Some biblical interpreters have long identified these nations as including Turkey, Iran, and their allies. Now, Trump has worked precisely with Turkey's Erdogan to obtain this agreement, and he has repeatedly said he wanted to integrate Iran into the Abraham Accords, those normalization treaties between Israel and Arab countries that he initiated during his first term. Is this a coincidence, or is Trump playing a role without even knowing it in aligning the pieces of the prophetic puzzle? There's also the question of Jerusalem. Trump's plan doesn't provide for the creation of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. In fact, it doesn't provide for any Palestinian state at all. Netanyahu said it explicitly. Israel still refuses the creation of a Palestinian state. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar even declared that recognizing a Palestinian state now would reward Hamas for the October 7th massacre. So, what happens to Palestinians in this scenario? If Gaza is transformed into a tourist zone controlled by an international force, if hundreds of thousands of Gazans are displaced to other Arab countries, if the West Bank remains under Israeli occupation indefinitely, then where is the Palestinian self-determination promised by so many international agreements? For some Christian Zionists, this is exactly the goal. They don't want a Palestinian state. They want all the land of biblical Israel to return under Jewish control, because that's what, according to them, will allow the fulfillment of end-times prophecies. But there's a fascinating paradox in this alliance between Trump, Israel, and evangelical Christians. Christian Zionists believe that Jews must control Israel for Christ to return. But their theology also teaches that during this return, all Jews must accept Jesus as Messiah, or they will perish. In other words, they support Israel today, but their prophetic vision implies the forced conversion or disappearance of Jews who would refuse Christ. It's a deeply ambiguous alliance. Israel accepts it because it needs American political and financial support. Evangelicals accept it because they believe they're playing a role in the divine plan. But the final objectives are radically different. For Israel, the Jewish nation-state is an end in itself. For Christian Zionists, it's a means toward an eschatological end that would see the end of Judaism as we know it. On October 14th, Trump made a stunning statement. During a meeting of his cabinet at the White House, he acknowledged that some hostage bodies would be a little difficult to find. Some were buried in collapsed tunnels. Others were moved several times. Hamas may not even know exactly where they all are. But Trump insisted, once all hostages and all remains have been returned, then the next phase will begin. The disarmament of Hamas, the progressive withdrawal of Israeli troops, the reconstruction of Gaza, and perhaps, if all goes well, a strong, lasting and eternal peace, according to his own words. But aren't these words a little too grandiose? Eternal peace in the Middle East? That's a promise that even God hasn't yet fulfilled, according to Scripture. So how can Trump guarantee what no leader in history has been able to accomplish? The answer may lie in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 27. The prophet Daniel speaks of a future leader who will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. This prophetic week is often interpreted as a period of 7 years. But in the middle of this week, this leader will put an end to sacrifice and offering. Many evangelical theologians identify this character as the Antichrist, the one who will seem to bring peace to the Middle East, but who will end up betraying Israel and triggering the Great Tribulation described in Revelation. Does Trump fit this portrait? Some evangelical Christians say no. He's too favorable to Israel. He supports Christian values. He moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. Others aren't so sure. They notice Trump's pride, his obsession with deals, his way of presenting himself as the savior of impossible situations. They wonder if a man who promises eternal peace in the Middle East isn't playing with forces he doesn't understand. What's undeniable is that we're living through an unprecedented historical moment. Never before has an American president succeeded in obtaining a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in so little time. The Bush, Obama, Biden administrations all failed. Trump did it in a few weeks. How? Through a combination of threats, intense diplomatic pressure, massive economic promises, and personal relationships with authoritarian Middle Eastern leaders. He worked with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who was involved in the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. He praised Turkish President Erdogan, whom he described as tough as you can be, but we love him. He accepted a gigantic private jet as a gift from the Emir of Qatar, the country that hosts Hamas leaders in exile. Trump has no qualms about doing business with oppressive regimes if it serves his objectives. And in this case, it worked. But here's the question haunting minds. Will this plan really hold? The following phases provide for the complete disarmament of Hamas, the total withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, the deployment of an international stabilization force composed of Arab and perhaps European troops, and the reconstruction of Gaza with tens of billions of dollars in investments. All this must happen in an environment where 80% of Gaza's buildings have been destroyed, where nearly 67,000 Palestinians have died since October 7, 2023, the majority of whom were civilians, women and children, where 170,000 people have been injured, including 40,000 with long-term fatal injuries. How do you rebuild a society on such ruins? How do you create trust between two peoples who have killed each other for 2 years? And then there's Iran. Trump didn't directly mention Iran in his Knesset speech, but everyone knows Iran is the elephant in the room. Iran finances Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. If Iran decides to sabotage the agreement, it can do so in an instant. A simple arms delivery to Hamas, a proxy attack from Lebanon or Yemen, and everything collapses. Trump threatened Iran on March 17th after the Houthis attacked American ships in the Red Sea. The United States bombed Houthi positions for 3 consecutive days, but that didn't stop the attacks. Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi declared on October 9th, "Will this agreement truly end the aggression against Gaza? We must remain at the highest level of vigilance and readiness." In other words, the Houthis are keeping their finger on the trigger, and if Iran gives them the order to resume attacks, they will. There's also the question of humanitarian aid. Since January 2025, Israel has established an aid distribution system in Gaza that goes through a private foundation, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, created by the United States with Israeli support. This foundation completely excludes the United Nations, which Israel accuses of benefiting Hamas. The problem is that this system has been catastrophic. Hundreds of Palestinians have died in stampedes near food distribution points. Non-governmental organizations from around the world have called for the dissolution of this Foundation calling it an inhumane system that worsens the crisis rather than resolving it, but Israel refuses to let the UN return, and Trump supports this position. So, how are we going to feed 2 million people in the coming months? How are we going to rebuild hospitals, schools, basic infrastructure? Trump's plan gives no concrete details on these questions. It talks about vast humanitarian aid operations, but doesn't say who will organize them or how. Let's now return to the most troubling, prophetic dimension of this entire story. In the book of Revelation, chapter 16, verse 16, John the Apostle describes a final battle called Armageddon, which will take place in the valley of Megiddo in Israel. This battle will see the ultimate confrontation between the forces of good and evil and will end with Christ's glorious return. Many evangelical Christians believe we are approaching this battle. They see the signs everywhere: wars in the Middle East, the rise of global anti-Semitism, increasingly frequent natural disasters, the moral decadence of Western society. For them, every major event in the Middle East is potentially one more step toward the end times. So when Trump announces that he has ended the Gaza war and promises eternal peace, some rejoice, thinking he's paving the way for the millennium. Others worry, wondering if he's not unwittingly preparing the ground for the Great Tribulation. There's a particularly fascinating detail in all this. Trump talked about transforming Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. He envisions luxury beaches, hotels, mass tourism. But in Ezekiel 47, the prophet describes a vision of the future messianic kingdom where waters from the Jerusalem temple will flow toward the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, bringing life and fertility wherever they pass. These waters will heal the land and create an incredible abundance of fish and vegetation. Does Trump's vision of a transformed Gaza echo, even unconsciously, this biblical prophecy of a restored and prosperous land? Or is it simply a gigantic real estate project motivated by economic interest? On October 12th, as preparations for the hostages' return were in full swing, Israeli President Isaac Herzog published a statement that received little attention but is revealing. He said, "May our prayers be realized, not may our efforts succeed or may diplomacy work. No, may our prayers be realized." This is deeply religious language. It's the recognition that what's happening transcends politics, that spiritual forces are at work, that we may be living through the fulfillment of ancient prophecies that no one really understands. And then there's this photo that went around the world. On October 12th, workers installed a red carpet at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv to welcome Trump. A red carpet for an American president coming to celebrate the end of a war. But in Revelation chapter 19, verse 14, John describes Christ's return. The armies of heaven were following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean, white and red, the colors of royalty and sacrifice. Was this red carpet in Tel Aviv just diplomatic protocol, or was it symbolically welcoming someone whom some consider almost a political messiah? Here's what we know for certain. Hamas has 72 hours to locate and hand over all hostages. If it fails or refuses, Trump has promised that everything will be back in play. Israel has agreed to begin a partial withdrawal, but maintains control of vast areas of Gaza. Hamas must completely disarm, a condition it has never accepted before, and that it could still secretly refuse. An international force must be deployed, but no one knows exactly who will be part of it or what its mandate will be. Gaza must be rebuilt, but 80% of buildings are destroyed, and humanitarian aid isn't reaching populations. Palestinians must accept not having an independent state for now, perhaps never. And all this must hold while Iran, Hezbollah, and the Houthis watch and wait for the right moment to strike. The coming weeks will be decisive. If Hamas honors the agreement, if weapons are surrendered, if tunnels are sealed, if no attacks occur, then perhaps we'll actually see the end of this war. But if a single rocket is fired, if a single attack takes place, if Hamas hides weapons instead of returning them, then everything will explode. And this time, it won't just be a war between Israel and Hamas. It will be a war directly involving the United States. Trump promised it, and Trump always keeps his promises when it comes to military force. There's a prophecy in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 6, verse 14, that says, "They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace." These words were written more than 2,600 years ago, but they resonate today with troubling force. Is Trump dressing a deep wound with a simple bandage? Is this announced peace real, or is it just a temporary illusion before an even more terrible storm? Only time will tell. What we can say is that we're living through a prophetic moment. Whether or not you believe in biblical prophecies, you cannot deny that something extraordinary is happening. An American president has succeeded where all others have failed. He obtained a ceasefire and the release of hostages in a few weeks. He imposed conditions that no one thought possible. He brought nations that hate each other around a negotiating table. And he now promises to transform a devastating war zone into a tourist paradise. It's either madness or genius, or perhaps both. But if you've watched this video this far, it's because you feel too that we're at a turning point in history. What's happening today in the Middle East will determine the region's future for decades to come, perhaps even for centuries. And if biblical prophecies are true, then what we're seeing now could be the alignment of the final pieces of the puzzle before Christ's return. Or perhaps everything will collapse in a few months, and we'll wonder how we could have believed that eternal peace was possible in a place that has known 3,000 years of war, as Trump himself said. But there's one thing I'm certain of. The story we just told isn't finished. It's only the beginning. In the coming weeks, we'll know if Hamas will keep its word. We'll know if Israel will respect the ceasefire. We'll know if Iran will intervene to sabotage the agreement. And we'll know if Donald Trump truly deserves the title of peacemaker he so covets. Stay with us, because what comes next could change the world forever.